Hello guys, welcome back to another tier list video. Today we're going to be looking over the jungle tier list for 4.1, and before we start I just want to say that check the description or my comment to see what's going on for the future videos, because I have some hardware issues, so videos may be, or the major videos at least, the guide will be delayed a little bit, and we may just be going through tier list or replay reviews for the next few days, or next week, maybe even, rather, depending on how long it takes for me to get a new mouse. So yeah, check the description or comments for that. But anyway, let's get into the tier list, and I'm going to try to make this one a little bit shorter to see if I'm able to do it. So I'm going to try to go through these a bit faster than before, because jungle especially has a lot of champions to go over. Because there are just so many viable junglers. So let's just get right into S tier, and we can kind of talk about Elise, Lee Sin, and Olaf all at the same time. They kind of all do the same thing. They're all extremely strong early gankers. They all do a lot of damage. They're all very durable, and Elise and Lee Sin especially are very good pick champions, and Olaf is a very strong anti-carry in terms of fighting against something like Jinx or Olaf. Jinx or Draven, he can just run straight through their CC and keep throwing axes at them, make it really easy to set up a kill for the rest of his team, and because he has so much base damage himself, can also kill them very easily. Elise also has a lot of percent damage to take down objectives as well as tanks in the game, and Lee Sin is just extremely mobile, very strong early ganks, and he can set up very easy against carries with his ultimate, assuming you are able to ward hop. Vi is the one champion in S tier that kind of doesn't fit the mold. She's not a strong early ganker. She doesn't have, well, she does have good pick potential at least, but her main thing is that she has her ultimate for engage, which is very strong versus these very immobile carries that we have nowadays, such as Jinx, Draven, Ziggs, Orianna. These champions that are very vulnerable to an engage from Vi, and because there's kind of a lack of hard engage from the jungle now, Vi is one of the champions that can do well in the current meta because she's a strong pick champion, but also do well because she has engage. When we look at champions that previously were played in the jungle that had very strong engage, such as Nocturne or Jarvan, maybe even Sejuani, Mumu, stuff like that, they aren't good pick champions. While they are very good initiation champions, their pick potential is a lot lower, whereas Vi has good pick potential as well as good engage. So Vi is kind of the only one left that can do extremely well in the current meta, and the only one that is actually deserving of S tier anymore. Next up we have A tier, which includes Gragas, Pantheon, Kha'Zix, Evelynn, Nocturne, and Mumu. Gragas is a champion who is very strong early. I've said it in the past in one of my replays that I think Gragas has the best 1 through 5 ganking in the game, assuming he has flash, and going into the mid to late game he does have a bit of an awkward transition because he is an AP caster, so he's not your initiator or your tank, something that the other S tier champions can provide, which is the main reason why Gragas isn't in S tier, is because he's not really a bruiser or a tank. So he does have a bit of an awkward transition, but because Gragas is just so strong, he is deserving of the first spot in A tier just because of his early ganking and his potential to just blow people up and displace them. Works extremely good in combinations with reset champions mid like Kha'Zix or Katarina, or Jinx as well. Pantheon is a champion that I've thought has been extremely strong for a very long time now. As a bot lane player, you have to play extremely different when you're playing against a Pantheon. Suddenly, post 6, you can't push past halfway through the lane or else you're going to die, especially in combination with champions like Annie, Leona, or Thresh, who can set up extremely easy ultimates for Pantheon. So just the fact that you have to play completely different when you're playing against them is one of the reasons why Pantheon is extremely good in the current meta. Plus he also offers the hard engage that's very uncommon in current junglers. And And Evelyn kind of falls in the same vein, so we'll talk about her at the same time. Playing versus Pantheon and Evelyn, you have to play differently versus both of them than anyone else in the game, because they can gank you from places that you normally could not get ganked from. Evelyn did get nerfed, and for some reason everyone stopped playing her even though the nerfs weren't that significant. I think that Evelyn is still extremely strong, just for the same reason that Pantheon is strong, is that you have to play differently versus them, and just the fact that you have to play a super passive against them gives them such a huge boost in strength. Even if they never actually gank you, they're still quasi-ganking you by forcing you to play a different way. Basically, they have presence without ever showing it, and that's why they're both very strong. Plus, Evelyn also has very hard engage also, and works well with reset champions because her ultimate does percent health damage, percent health current damage, which means it does more against high health targets, which means it works good in combination with reset champions. Moving on to Kha'Zix, I think Kha'Zix is not very good in competitive play, but he is very strong on solo queue, and because this is kind of a mashed up tier list of competitive and solo queue, I put him in pretty high up in A tier, just because in solo queue he can easily carry a game by just farming it out. So he's very strong because of that. In a competitive game, I think he relies much more on a team being built around him, which is why we haven't seen Kha'Zix have too much success in competitive play. But obviously he is extremely strong in solo queue. Just his carry potential is through the roof pretty much. Moving on to Nocturne. Nocturne is a champion who I think is extremely underrated in the current meta. I think he's kind of similar to Vi in the sense that he has on-demand engage. The one thing that he doesn't have going for him is that unlike Vi, his ultimate does not CC immediately after, which makes it hard for other people to follow up. But at the same time, it does block out vision, which is extremely good, and also kind of forces the support to peel the jungler off the AD carry, because if not, Nocturne will just solo the AD carry because of how strong he is, how strong of a duelist he is. So if your support is forced to automatically peel, then you have two people fighting off the jungler when the jungler isn't even one of the main threats. So that leaves the other three threats in your team to just kind of go to town when you're playing Nocturne, which is very useful. And he also kind of has the same thing as Pantheon and Evelyn, where you have to play differently against him because he can ult you from further range than anyone else in the game can. Or not anyone else in the game, but any of the other standard junglers. Moving on to Amumu. Amumu is another champion I think is extremely underrated. I always go on this rant every time I talk about Amumu because there are a lot of things that are always said about him that aren't true, and I've always kind of stuck up for Amumu for the past like 2 years or so, because people have always said things like he's not a strong early ganker, or he gets counter jungled easily, or he doesn't have fast clear time, or things like this that just are so untrue that it's just very obvious to tell that when people don't understand Amumu. He has extremely fast clear times, extremely fast objective control from his percent health damage, extremely good engage. His early ganks aren't that great, but it's still better than some champions. Like I would argue that maybe even Amumu's ganks are better than Vi's early ganks. No, I wouldn't say that actually, but it is pretty close in power level. He does have a CC at least, or hard CC, which is more than some of these champions can say. Like Kha'Zix doesn't have a hard CC. And he's actually an extremely strong duelist early, especially against champions that have attack speed buffs like Evelyn, Elise, Vi, because his tantrum will just keep getting reset, which causes him to do more and more damage as the fight goes on. But really, the main reason why Amumu is so good is the same reason why I think Amumu's support is good, which is that his engage is just amazing, and that's pretty much all there is to it. Moving on to B tier, we have Wukong, Fiddle, Shyvana, Xin Zhao, Jarvan, Maokai, and Riven. think Wukong is kind of just a worse version of Amumu. I think they're pretty close in power level and pretty close in their job, but their job being to initiate and cause a lot of AoE disruption. But I think in the end, Amumu is able to build tankier, which means he's able to stay in the fight longer, whereas Wukong has to actually build damage to do a significant amount of damage. Whereas Amumu can just build tanky and then get resets on his tantrum to do a lot of damage. Plus Amumu also scales better into late game with his percent health damage. So I think Wukong is good, but just a tier below Amumu. Kind of does the same thing, but just worse. Fiddle is back in business now that his fear got changed back to a actual fear instead of a terrify. But his feared duration did still get nerfed, so he took a hit there. But he is one of the only two, let's see if that's true, one of the only, unless you're including Kale, he's one of the only two ranged junglers in the game. So that means he's able to push towers easily in 2v1 situations. And he also has really fast tower pushing with his, or wave pushing with his crows. And then his ultimate is just a lot of AoE disruption in team fights, which allows reset champions to kind of raise havoc. And similar to Nocturne, he is a threat, a jungle threat that needs to be answered immediately, or else he will just destroy your team. So having one of those threats in your team that need, or a jungle threat in your team that needs to be dealt with first, is something very rare. Something that Kha'Zix can also do. So these jungle champions that are a threat on their own cause your other threats on your team to just rise up and kind of carry the day after you die, because they've spent so many resources taking care of you. Next up is Shyvana, who I was tempted to put in honorable mentions because she's not, I don't really consider her a jungler, but she was originally a jungler after all, so I figured I would just include her here. I don't think she's not like any of the other junglers we looked at so far. Her early game is atrocious. She really doesn't do anything except farm. But because her mid to late game is so strong when she gets items, her early game being bad is kind of irrelevant. Especially when you can kind of just rely on counter ganking. Because in a straight up fight, she's actually pretty strong. Just that her ganking is really bad. So you kind of have to rely on counter ganking to do well, because if you're able to counter gank, then you don't need to like have that CC or gap closer. You can just run into the lane and be there to fight or scare them off. Because her straight up damage is actually really high. It's just that she's not able to gank because she has no gap closer or what do you call it, hard CC. So yeah, she's very weak early but strong in the later parts of the game, which makes up for her weak early game. Xin Zhao is the complete opposite. His early game is incredibly powerful, but he kind of falls off in late game. We can talk about Jarvan and Xin Zhao at the same time because they're pretty similar. I don't think that Xin Zhao scales or falls off as hard as Jarvan in the late game. I think Xin Zhao actually has a better late game than most people think, although it is still relatively bad. He has potential to do extremely well with champions like Kha'Zix, Katarina, these reset champions that, because similar to Evelyn, he has current health percent, how is the best way to say this, percent current health damage. So that means that it will do a lot of damage to high health targets, which allows reset champions to pretty much shine, because it takes them all low enough in range to reset off them. And he also gets a lot of armor and MR for every target that he hits, which makes him really durable. So yeah, I don't think Xin Zhao is as bad in the late game as people think he is, but he is a little bit weaker than other champions. But Xin Zhao and Jarvan pretty much both do the same thing in the early game. They both want to gank mid lane especially, and then once it gets to level 6 maybe they can go gank bottom lane or something like that. But they both just kind of want to sit in mid lane and camp, because champions like Syndra, Orianna, can't really do much to avoid them or live through their ganks. They kind of just die if they don't have flash up, so they can just camp mid really easily and be really strong in the early parts of the game. And they also have very strong or very good power spikes level 6, especially if you're going for something like an early brutalizer. So yeah, these champions, Xin Zhao and Jarvan, are just polar opposite of Shyvana, basically. Weak early, or very strong early game, but weak later parts in the game. Maokai and Riven are kind of want to do the same thing as Xin Zhao and Jarvan, just gank mid early, but they don't really fall off as hard, although their early game isn't as strong. They also don't fall off as hard as Xin Zhao and Jarvan do. They're kind of like an in-between. Maokai's ultimate does really well against champions like Ziggs and Gragas, who do a lot of AoE damage. Maokai can kind of just throw down his ultimate and it'll reduce a lot of that damage. And he also does very well against no escape AD carries, and again, he does really well ganking mid early on. Riven, damage-wise, meaning you're building damage items, did get nerfed in the last patch, which is why people have stopped playing her so much. But Tank Riven actually got buffed, which is how I prefer to play her and how I think she's best in the jungle. You've also seen Kakao from KT Bullets play it quite a lot as his fourth choice after Elise, Lee Sin, and Olaf are banned. So Tank Riven is pretty good. It basically relies on getting CDR and tanking up, and then you just use your abilities to CC. And she also works extremely well with upfront burst champions such as Gragas or Ziggs, because her ultimate is an AoE execute. That doesn't really scale, or it does still scale with AD obviously, but it's still just like Lee Sin basically. You don't need AD for an execute to do a lot of damage. So with a champion like Gragas or Ziggs, who does a lot of upfront burst and takes everyone low, Riven's ultimate does a lot of damage even if you're building tank. Next up is C tier, which includes Karma, Hecarim, Rammus, Volibear, Sejuani, and Nautilus. And as you notice, I haven't put Karma in honorable mentions because I actually think that she's a better jungler than she is a support. Now, you all know I don't like Karma very much as support. I've said it multiple times in past occasions. But I do think that she's actually a pretty good jungler. Well, not pretty good, but she's average, I would say. C tier, average. But she can work well in certain compositions. If you have carries elsewhere in your team, she can work really well. And especially if you're running like an unconventional support, like, I don't know, Mundo, Mumu, something weird like that, Karma jungle can work pretty well, just because you already have like another tanky person on your team. Or even if you're just running with a Leona, then it works well. But because Karma is lacking damage, you need to make up for that damage somewhere on your team. So just keep that in mind when you're playing her. But yeah, she's very comp specific. Moving on to Hecarim. I think Hecarim is kind of a strange champion. Not really sure how powerful he is, but if I had to guess, I would put him in C tier. I think he, how to explain? His engage is mediocre, basically. It's not as good as someone like Vi or Mumu or even Jarvan. So his engage is kind of weak. His early game is weak. His late game is pretty strong once he hits like the items that his core items. If you're going for like a Trinity Force, Spirit Visit or something like that, on top of Randuin's, maybe you're just going for like Spirit Lizard Elder, Randuin, Spirit Visage. When he gets like that third item in the combo, he starts becoming pretty strong because he just doesn't die with his W. But I think his early game is just too weak to really justify playing him. And I should also say that the difference between B tier and C tier is much more than the difference between A tier and B tier, or S tier and A tier. So basically, these champions are all like S through B tier are champions that I would suggest playing on. Basically, that I would suggest playing, and then C through D tier champions that I would stray away from or that aren't very good. Still viable, obviously, but not that great. Rammus, the taunt nerf just hit him too hard. There's really no reason why they need to nerf the taunt like that. They could have nerfed him in other areas, or at least gave him a more significant buff in other areas. I forget what they even buffed about him. They buffed something, but it wasn't enough, basically, to justify the taunt nerf. He was never really that strong in competitive play to begin with. He was extremely strong in solo queue, but now with the taunt nerfs, it's just... it's too much, I think. I was tempted to put him in B tier because I think that he is still really strong in solo queue, but because he's not very good in competitive play, I decided to put him in C tier instead. Volibear is pretty much does the same thing as Xin Zhao, Jarvan, Maokai, or Riven in the early game, which is he just wants to camp middle because middle is an extremely easy lane for him to gank. And outside of something like a Thresh, it's going to be really hard for Volibear to gank bottom. And yeah, so Volibear just doesn't really do too much in the mid to late game either. He does have a power spike level 6, but yeah, outside of that, his jungle clear is really slow. His ganking is mediocre. Doesn't have an actual gap closer besides the speed buff that he gets, and yeah, he's just not very good, especially not versus knockbacks. Moving on to Sejuani. Sejuani is just a worse version of Mumu. Same with Nautilus. They both have really slow clear times. They both have lower damage than Mumu. They both have worse engage than Mumu. Yeah, Sejuani and Nautilus are just worse versions of Mumu. That's all I have to say about them. Moving on to D tier, we have Master Yi, who he's just a pub stomper. That's really all there is to it. I can kind of talk about Master Yi and Aatrox in the same vein because they're similar. Actually, Udyr is the same too. Master Yi, Aatrox, and Udyr are just all pub stompers. They all suck in competitive play. I mean, I know there are a lot of Chick2G fans out there that are going to be wondering why I put Volibear and Udyr so low and when Chick2G can do so well on them. And the answer is just because they're solo queue champions. They're not... that on top of him being a specialist, they're just not competitive champions. Like, Aatrox used to be really good, but then they nerfed him so hard. They took off like 20% attack speed and like 50 damage off one of his E, and that was just huge. And he was already not good late game, so them taking away from the early game made it to where there was no point in even playing him. Because now he kind of just, I mean, even before when he was strong, he didn't do anything late game. He would just jump in and die, and then he would build like a GA, so he would have 2 revives, but he would just jump in and die. But anyway, Master Yi, just a pub stomper. He doesn't have any of the qualities that you want in a competitive jungler. Same with Udyr, kind of the same thing as Volibear, except Udyr is basically like a farming version of Volibear. Volibear wants to gank more, which is why I would say he's more effective, whereas Udyr is kind of like Shyvana, except worse. Shyvana can farm up items and be really strong, whereas Udyr can farm up items and then still get kited, basically. I would be tempted to put Udyr in C tier maybe, but even still, like, the difference between Shyvana and Udyr is so big. Shyvana has scales in a late game with percent damage. She has much more AoE damage. She has an actual gap closer. She has AoE CC. Everything about Shyvana is just better. Anyway, moving on to Skarner, who has the honor of last place. Yeah, he's just not... His clear time... The mana nerf to Skarner actually really hurt, which may actually be better now with the new jungle items. Now that I think about it, Skarner may actually be better now that he can build Golem Spirit and actually get mana back from jungling. But yeah, outside of that, focusing down one target really doesn't really doesn't mean that much in the current meta, especially if you need your flash to do it, which sounds odd because I'm saying that when I have Vi in S tier. But the thing is that Vi doesn't need flash to engage for one, and it's also like an on-demand thing. It's not Skarner where you can see it coming or you can CC Skarner or something. When Vi does it, Vi just goes through and it's done. After Skarner ults, you can CC him and hold your teammate in place. And Skarner also relies on flash. It just generally doesn't have good early ganks either. Yeah. Anyway, moving on to honorable mentions. So you'll see that I have letters next to all of the honorable mentions. That's because these are champions that I think are much better in other lanes, but they can still jungle. And the letter that I put next to them are the tiers that I would place them in. So I'll just talk about them all very quickly. Mundo, obviously much better in top lane. I would say maybe even better as a support than he is as a jungle. But still, just because he's so strong currently, he's still A tier jungle, just because he's Mundo. So yeah, his poke is really useful. His early ganks are actually really strong with cleavers. His jungle is kind of sketchy with all the damage that he takes, but now with Golem Spirit that will just heal you for all the damage that you do in the jungle, it's actually not bad at all. Plus he has a lot of sustain through his ultimate anyway. And then late game, obviously, he just becomes unkillable, impossible to deal with, and becomes a carry of his own as a jungler. Kayle, extremely strong champion again. She's just god tier mid laner, so yeah, she can also do well in the jungle just because of how strong Kayle is in general. Her clear time is actually extremely fast, probably even the fastest clear time out of this entire list. Yes, she is that fast. And yeah, into the late game, she just does so much damage, and her ultimate is also really good against reset champions or pretty much anyone in general right now. Jax, obviously a much better top laner, but he can do well as jungle. His early ganks are actually pretty fast. His jungle is extremely safe. He takes almost no damage at all. And into the late game, obviously, he can become a split pushing monster. Kind of the same thing with Shen. Shen has pretty good early ganks, but his, well, I would say decent early ganks, but his damage is definitely lacking. I used to start Doran's Blade on Shen jungle just to have more early game damage. And I'll also run with like attack speed reds with 80 quints just to have more early game damage, because his early ganks are actually pretty strong if you're able to land a taunt. Similar to Gragas with his taunt flash. But at the end of the day, a much better top laner, but he is equivalent of C tier. Trundle, same thing, much better top laner, but his pillar is the main reason why I would put him in C tier for, because that's really the only thing that he has going for him in the jungle. His ultimate is also really good to kind of tear people down, but his clear time is just too low. His early ganks suck too much, and yeah, it doesn't really scale that well into the late game. So C tier for him. Warwick, B tier, obviously a much better top laner, but assuming you are able to hit his power spike in the mid to late game, Warwick is a god. So kind of put him on the same tier as Shyvana. Very strong if you can hit that late game, but his early game is very much lacking. Zed, kind of the same thing as Shyvana, except in the sense that he just wants to farm. His early ganks suck, but he is a worse duelist than Shyvana, and he also doesn't function as a tank, which means an assassin in the jungle is kind of weak. Maybe like even like Kha'Zix, except much worse because less damage than Kha'Zix. In general, it doesn't have resets, and its early ganks are much worse. Anyway, that's it for this tier list. Hopefully you guys still enjoyed the video with shorter explanations. As you can see, there were a lot of champions to talk about, so I had to make the explanations a little bit shorter, and hopefully maybe you guys will maybe even enjoy it a little bit more. Anyway, if you have any suggestions or anything, make sure to put them in the comments below, and if you have any differing opinions, make sure you let me know that as well. And yeah, make sure you check the description or comments to see what's going on in future videos as well. And I think that will do it. I will see you guys for the next video. See ya.